I have told this story perhaps 100 times since that winter, and every time I reach the moment when Aldrich Vane, the Duke of Varnhollow, the most private and least sentimental man I have ever known, leaned forward in his chair and said quietly to the auctioneer, "Double it." I feel the same thing I felt standing 4 feet behind him on the night it happened. The absolute certainty that the world had just shifted on its axis, and that nothing in the drawing rooms of England would ever be quite the same again. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is Aldrich's habit, not mine. Let me begin where the story truly begins, not at the creditors gathering in the candlelit upper hall of Chiswick House, but 3 hours earlier, when he told me he was not going. We were in his library at Varnhollow, he and I, in the last gray week of November, with the kind of weather outside that makes the inside of a library feel like the only honest place in England. He was at his desk with a stack of correspondence he claimed to be attending to, and I was in the armchair nearest the fire with a book I had stopped reading 20 minutes earlier, because reading is difficult when the person across the room has been staring at the same page for a quarter of an hour and has not turned it once. That was Aldrich that autumn, there but not quite present. He had been back from the continent for 6 months by then. He had spent the better part of a year there on what he described as estate matters, and what anyone who knew him understood to be a man trying to outpace something that would not be outpaced. He was not a man who advertised his interior life. He had been to 2 social engagements since his return, one of them a funeral, and had declined the rest with the smooth brevity of a man who has decided that politeness and presence are not the same obligation. I had known Aldrich Vane since we were young men at school together, which is to say, I had known him long enough to read the precise quality of his silences, and the silence that evening was the kind that comes not from contentment, but from a man who is waiting for something and does not know what he is waiting for. "Chiswick has sent a 3rd invitation," I said, setting down the book I was not reading. "I am aware." He turned a page he had not read. "It is a creditors' gathering, drinks, a supper, and apparently a resolution of his most pressing obligations. I have no interest in Chiswick's debts." "You don't," I agreed. "But Lord Dunhaven will be there, and you have been trying to get 10 minutes with Dunhaven since September. The Northern Road franchise will not wait much longer." He said nothing. He looked at the page. "1 hour," I said. "In and out. Dunhaven, the franchise conversation, and we are back before midnight." He was quiet for the span of perhaps 30 seconds. Then he set down his pen, looked at the fire in the way he looked at fires when he was deciding something he had already decided, and said, "1 hour." "1 hour," I agreed. We did not know, of course, what Chiswick had arranged for the resolution of his debts. I did not know, it had not been in the invitation, and the rumor that had apparently been circulating among the creditors' circle had not reached me in time. We arrived at Chiswick House at 7:30, with no expectation beyond a tedious social obligation efficiently discharged. Her name, as I later learned it, was Miss Marin Elvey. Her father, a gentleman of modest but respectable estate in the northern part of the county, a quiet man by all accounts, the kind who managed carefully and lived within what he had died 3 years prior, leaving behind 2 things of any significance: a daughter of 24, and a debt to Edmund Chiswick that had accumulated through the slow arithmetic of bad harvests, a failed venture in the cloth trade, and the particular cruelty of careful men dying young and leaving their affairs to careless ones. Her mother had married Chiswick some years before her father's death, a second marriage, the kind that seemed prudent at the time and revealed themselves gradually as something else. Her mother had died the previous spring. She had, as of that November, nothing in the world but a modest trunk of good quality clothes worn thin by care, a reasonable education acquired through her own determined persistence, and the considerable misfortune of being Edmund Chiswick's stepdaughter at the precise moment Edmund Chiswick, had decided that the most efficient way to clear his ledgers was to treat every liability in his possession as transferable. The hall at Cheswick House was fuller than I had expected. There were perhaps 30 men, most of them creditors or associates of creditors, or the kind of men who attend gatherings like this because they have heard a rumor and want to see whether it is the interesting kind. The chandelier was bright. The wine was plentiful and indifferent. Cheswick moved through his guests with the energy of a man who is profoundly afraid and has decided the best answer to fear is volume, greeting people too heartily, laughing a moment too long at nothing very amusing, refilling glasses that did not require refilling. Aldrich found Dunhaven within 10 minutes, which was why we had come, and began the conversation about the Northern Road franchise he had been waiting months to have. I found myself at the periphery of the room with my indifferent glass of wine and the growing sense, formless at first, then sharpening, that this evening was going to be considerably stranger than a supper among creditors. At 8 o'clock, Cheswick called the room to attention. He stood at the far end of the hall near the great fireplace and spoke in the tone of a man who has rehearsed something he knows is indefensible and has decided that momentum will carry him through the indefensible parts if he does not slow down. He spoke about debts in the abstract, about the difficulty of obligations in uncertain times, about resolution and arrangement, and the burden on a man of good standing to manage his affairs with integrity. He used the word arrangement 5 times before he used the word auction once, and when he used the word auction, the room went very still. Then the door at the side of the hall opened, and she walked in. Not was brought in, not was led or pushed or guided by anyone's hand. She walked in, and the distinction mattered enormously, and I noticed it immediately, and I noticed that everyone in the room noticed it, because the specific quality of the stillness changed when she appeared. It deepened. She was dressed plainly in a gray wool gown that was not fashionable and not new but was neat and clean and pressed, worn with a composure that would have shamed half the women in the county's finest ballrooms. Her hair was dark, arranged simply and well, nothing about it designed to impress and nothing about it failed. She was not beautiful in the way that causes noise, the kind of beauty that announces itself and demands a reaction. She was beautiful in the way that causes silence, the kind of beauty that is completely composed of dignity and clarity and a refusal to be diminished, and the room went silent the moment she entered it. She looked at no one in particular. She found a point on the far wall. I saw her find it, the specific lifting of the chin and steadying of the eyes, and she looked at it. And I watched her draw one careful breath through her nose and settle her shoulders by approximately 1/4 of an inch. And in that 1/4 of an inch, I understood everything there was to understand about what it was costing her to be in this room. Cheswick described her. Her age, her education, her health, her skills in household management and French, her fitness for any number of domestic situations, in the pleasant, efficient tone of a man describing livestock at a market where he is anxious to be done and paid. He gave the opening figure, which was modest by the standards of the room. Across the hall, in the middle of a sentence about road franchises, Aldrich Vane stopped speaking. I know this because I was watching him in the way I always watched him in company, not constantly, but with the background attention of 15 years' friendship, and I saw the moment his attention shifted. He stopped mid-sentence, and his head turned toward her the way a compass needle turns north. Not a decision, not a choice, just an immediate and total reorientation. Dunhaven said something. Aldrich did not hear it. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look at him. She was looking at her point on the far wall with the absolute concentration of a woman who has decided that the far wall is the one thing she is going to know for certain in this room. The bidding began. There were several men who were interested in the way that men at these gatherings are interested, which is to say with the calculation of people who see an opportunity and the particular unpleasantness of people who are comfortable treating a person as an opportunity. The figures climbed in small increments, the way cowardly bidders bid when they want the thing, but do not want to be seen to want it too much. A man near the window was the most persistent, raising each figure by a small and tedious amount, with the look of someone who intends to wear down the room through sheer repetition. And then Aldrich said, from his side of the room, in the voice he used when he had decided something and the deciding was already finished, "Double the current figure." The room shifted. Men turned. Chesick blinked and then recovered and said something smooth about what a generous opening, and before he had finished saying it, the man near the window had raised the figure by the same small increment he had been using, which was the bid of a man who had not fully processed what had just entered the room. Aldrich looked at him. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then he named a figure that was not a bid in the conventional sense, but a termination of the conversation, and he named it in the flat, declarative tone of a man who has made a decision and is informing the room of the fact. The bidding was over. The room understood this even if the auctioneer needed a moment to catch up, because the room understood Aldrich Vane in the way that rooms full of people who have spent their lives calculating power understand it. He was the most consequential person present. He had spoken, and the conversation was done. Chesick said something about terms in a private word, and Aldrich crossed the room. He did not go to Chesick, he went to her. She had been watching him approach from the moment the bidding ended. She had come off her point on the far wall, and she was watching him cross the floor with an expression I could not entirely read from my distance. Wariness at the front of it, certainly, and something else working very hard underneath the wariness that was not quite hope and not quite its absence. He stopped 2 feet from her. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder, with a face that is at its most itself when it is serious, and he was entirely serious. He said, not quietly but not loudly, in the level voice of a man stating a plain fact, "I am Aldrich Vane. I am the Duke of Varnhollow. You will not be going anywhere tonight with Edmund Chesick, and no condition is attached to what I just paid. You may go wherever you wish." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "That is a considerable sum to spend on someone's freedom with no condition attached, Your Grace." He said, "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a breath. Then he said, "Because no one else was going to." There was nothing she could say to that, and the silence that followed it was the most complete thing in the room. She knew it was true. She had been standing in that hall for 20 minutes and no one else had, and she knew that he knew she knew, and she looked at him very directly and said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and the steadiness in those 3 words cost her something visible. I could see it cost her something, and I think he could too. Chesick descended on them then, all congratulation and oiled relief, and Aldrich turned to him with the particular expression he had, not hostile, not warm, simply the closed face of a man who has concluded a transaction and regards all subsequent discussion of it as unnecessary, and said, with complete clarity, "The debt is settled and you are paid. Any further claim you intend to make on Miss Elvey's circumstances, her time, or her person will be handled through my solicitor, and I assure you it will not be a comfortable process for you." Then he turned back to her and said, more quietly, "My carriage is outside. My housekeeper is in it. I give you my word you will be received as a guest." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Very well." She left with him. I followed, because there was nothing left in that hall worth staying for. His housekeeper, Mrs. Bray, a woman of 55 who had been running Varnhollow for 3 decades, and who possessed a complete map of everyone's situation at all times, had been sent for before we left the estate that evening. I learned this later and was not surprised. Aldrich does not take action in halves. If he was going to that gathering, some part of him had decided what he might find there and had planned accordingly, though I suspect he would have described it as prudence rather than premonition. Mrs. Bray had a traveling blanket, a small hamper with bread and cold meat, and something hot in a flask, and the expression of a woman who had been given the facts in brief and had filled in the remainder with considerable accuracy. Marin Elve sat in the carriage across from Aldrich, and I sat beside him, and for the first 10 minutes she looked out the dark window at the passing countryside and said nothing. Mrs. Bray sat beside her and said nothing either, which was its own form of wisdom. The carriage was warm. Outside it was very cold. Then Marin said, still to the window, "I should be clear about something, Your Grace." Aldrich said, "Yes. I have no expectation of anything beyond what you have described. I am grateful, genuinely, and I will find my own arrangements in due course. I do not intend to be a burden on your household any longer than is necessary." He said, "There is a guest suite at Varnhollow. It is yours for as long as you need it." "That is very generous." "It is a room." She turned from the window then and looked at him with a precision that I had not expected, given the evening, given the hour, given everything. She said, "A room costs you nothing to offer and a considerable amount more than nothing to have spent tonight on my behalf. I mention this not to be ungrateful but so that we understand each other clearly. I will not confuse gratitude with obligation, and I would prefer that you not be confused that way either." Aldrich looked at her for a moment. I was watching him. Something shifted in his face, something that was not a smile but was the careful preliminary to one, as if the muscles involved had been out of use long enough that they required a moment to remember their purpose. He said, "We are not confused, Miss Elve." She looked at him a moment longer, then she looked back out the window. Mrs. Bray, beside her, quietly offered the flask of something hot. Marin took it with a murmured thanks and held it in both hands, and for a while nobody spoke, and the carriage moved through the dark and the cold toward Varnhollow, and that was the first hour of the thing that would become the rest of their lives. Varnhollow in November was a house that size had learned to be, vast and cold in its extremities, and quietly beautiful in the parts that were lived in. Aldrich had never been a man for the full sweep of a great estate. He used the library, the study, the breakfast room, the stables, and the habit of walking the grounds in the early mornings before the household stirred, and the rest of Varnhollow waited around those points of occupation, with the patience of rooms that have been waiting for a long time and have not given up. Marin was installed in the East Wing guest suite, which faced the garden and received the morning light. I have it from Mrs. Bray that she was up before dawn the next day and had folded her own bedding and put it at the foot of the bed by the time the housemaid arrived, and that when the housemaid expressed some confusion about this Marin apologized, with what Mrs. Bray described as a smile that arrived quickly and was gone quickly, and said that it was an old habit and she would try to leave it undone in future. I stayed for 10 days, which was longer than I had planned and not, I will be honest, for any reason that had to do with the Northern Road franchise. She was not what Cheswick had described. He had described her competencies in the manner of a factor describing a property for sale, accurate in the way that inventories are accurate, which is to say completely devoid of the things that matter. The French was there, and the household management, and the good health, and all of it meant nothing beside what was actually there, which was a mind of the first order in a person who had been given very little occasion to use it, and had used it anyway. She had read, not decoratively, not the novels and the improving texts that constituted a reasonable education for a young woman of her station, but widely and seriously, across history and natural philosophy and estate management and things she had no reason to know except that she had found the books and read them. She held opinions about what she had read, which she expressed without apology in a tone of precise good faith that took the position that an opinion was only useful if it was accurate, and therefore could only be improved by correction. The first conversation of any real length happened at dinner the second evening. Aldrich had asked her to join us, through Mrs. Bray, framing it as an invitation rather than a summons, and she had come, and they had been politely careful with each other across the soup and the fish, and I had been filling the careful silence with the light conversation that is my contribution to most dinners. And then I said something about the northern estates, some generalization about tenant farming that I had absorbed from someone else without fully understanding. And she said, without looking up from her plate, "That is not quite right, Mr. Ashwell." I should explain that Ashwell is my name, Thomas Ashwell. I had given it to her the previous evening, and she had used it without flourish, which I had found briefly and unreasonably pleasing. I said, "Is it not? The assumption that northern tenants resist improvement because they lack initiative," she said, still to her plate, then looking up at me with a perfectly level expression. "That is the generalization you are working from. It is wrong. The problem is not the tenant's initiative. It is that the improvements are designed by people who do not winter in the north, and what fails in January is not the tenant's will. It is the drainage systems, which are built to a standard that is adequate in the south and catastrophic in a northern frost." I said, "How do you know that?" "My father's estate was northern," she said. "I managed the household accounts from the time I was 17. I also managed the drainage correspondences, because my father asked me to, because I was the person in the house who could be relied on to follow an argument to its conclusion, rather than stopping at the point where it became inconvenient. I spent several Januaries watching what failed and why." Aldrich, who had not spoken for some time, set down his fork and said, "What would you have changed?" She looked at him. He was watching her with the full gravity of his attention. When Aldrich was fully attending to something, it was palpable, a quality in the air. And she held that attention for a moment and then, with the air of a woman deciding whether to say the short version or the correct one, told him the correct one. She spoke for 7 or 8 minutes about drainage grades and frost penetration, and the specific differences between clay-heavy northern soil and the lighter southern compositions, about what she had tried on her father's estate, and what had held, and what had failed, about the particular way that small improvements compound across a season if they are correctly sequenced, and collapse entirely if they are not. She spoke with the precision of someone who has actually done the thing rather than read about it, which is a different kind of knowledge and sounds like it. When she stopped, she became aware that she had been speaking for some time and looked briefly uncertain, the way a person looks when they have moved further into their own expertise than the room required. Aldrich said, "Go on." She looked at him again. He was still watching her with the same gravity. She went on. She spoke for another few minutes, and when she finished this time she set her fork back to her plate with the air of a person who has been more fully themselves than they intended and is not entirely sorry about it. After dinner she went into the music room, not invited, simply drifted toward it, the way people who have a genuine relationship with music drift toward an instrument when they find one in a room they are inhabiting, and played for perhaps half an hour. She played well, better than well. She played the way some people speak, as if the music were the natural medium of something she needed to say and had been patient about saying. Aldrich stood in the doorway of the music room for the full half hour and listened, and I sat by the fire in the drawing room and watched him stand in the doorway and listen, and I noted the quality of the watching, and I thought, "Ah, there it is. That is what has been missing from this house." The weeks that followed were the most concentrated thing I have ever had the privilege of observing closely. She was careful in the specific way of someone who has learned that hope is expensive and has paid its price and does not intend to be caught short again. She helped with the household in small, practical ways that no one had asked her to help with. Mrs. Bray received her offers with the pleasure of a woman who recognizes competence, and she read in the library every morning with the absorbed focus of someone who has been too long without access to a good one. And she walked in the East Garden when the weather permitted in a borrowed coat of Mrs. Bray's that was too large for her, and that she wore with the same quiet dignity she wore everything she possessed. She did not ask Aldrich for anything. I do not think she knew quite what that did to him. He was a man who had spent the better part of his adult life as an object of acquisition. His title, his estate, his connections, his money, the social advantage of proximity to him. And he had developed, by necessity, a very accurate sense of what it felt like to stand in a room with someone who wanted something from him. It was a quality in the air, a certain direction to the attention, a warmth that was not quite warmth because it was pointed. He could read it the way a sailor reads weather. He had been reading it since he was old enough to understand what a duke was, and what a duke was worth. She did not feel like that. She felt like, he told me this, in the library at midnight some weeks later, with a glass of brandy he was not drinking, standing in an open field after a long rain, clean and wide and without an agenda. He said he had forgotten that rooms could feel like that, and then he said that he was aware that sounded absurd, and I told him it did not sound absurd at all. He found reasons to be in whatever room she was in. I noticed this first in the small ways. He came down earlier for breakfast, and she was always earlier than early, and they would talk over eggs and toast about whatever she had been reading, which was never the same thing twice. He came into the library in the afternoons on errands that seemed to evaporate the moment he arrived. He stood in doorways of rooms she was in with the air of a man who has arrived somewhere and is surprised to find it where he expected. He asked her questions, real questions, questions that wanted the real answer, about the estate, about the North, about what she had observed in a morning's walk, about what she was reading. And she answered them, directly, thoroughly, without performance. And he listened to her answers in the way that I recognized from the music room, not politely, not charitably, but with the full weight of a mind that is genuinely engaged. He talked to me about it, the way he occasionally talked to me about things that mattered, late in the evenings when the house had gone quiet. He was not a man for confession or analysis, but he had, over 15 years, developed the habit of occasionally saying the thing aloud to me that he needed to hear in his own voice in order to know what it was. "She will think it is obligation," he said one evening, looking at the fire. I said, "Then tell her it isn't." She established from the first evening that she will not be confused by gratitude. She was speaking to herself as much as to me. She meant that she would not manufacture feeling out of relief, and I think she also meant that I ought not do the same. "And you are not doing the same." He was quiet for a moment. "No." "Then tell her, clearly. She is a woman who values clarity. You have both noticed that about each other." He looked at the fire a while longer. "She will not believe it." I leaned forward. She managed an estate at 17. She walked into that hall at Cheswick House in front of 30 men who were treating her like property, and she looked at the far wall and breathed and held herself absolutely together. "She told you your drainage was wrong on her second evening here. She is not a woman who will be mystified by a direct statement. What she will not be able to dismiss is specificity. Tell her specifically why, not that you feel it, why you feel it. She thinks in evidence. Give her evidence." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "When did you become wise?" I said, "I have always been wise." "You pay insufficient attention to it." The next morning I told Mrs. Bray that I would be departing on Wednesday, which was several days earlier than I had planned, and Mrs. Bray received this information with the expression of a woman who manages a very complicated household and is accustomed to arranging the movement of people to optimal effect. She said, "Very good, Mr. Ashwell," and I knew from her tone that it was, in fact, very good. The conversation happened on a Tuesday morning. I know because I was in my room packing on Tuesday when Mrs. Bray appeared at the door and mentioned, with complete neutrality, that Miss Elvey and His Grace had gone out to the East Garden, and was I planning to walk before the weather turned. I was not planning to walk. I said I was not and stayed at my packing. The window of my room did not face the East Garden, which was also very good. What I know of what happened I have assembled from what Aldrich told me that evening, and what Marin, in the years that followed, told me herself, sometimes one piece at a time over dinners and evenings, when the conversation found its way to the beginning of things, and she was willing to let it. He had found her at the frozen fountain in the East Garden. She was in the borrowed coat, looking at the fountain's ice-locked bowl, and the morning was the particular kind of clear that November makes when it has decided to be honest instead of hostile, hard light, sharp edges, the kind of morning that shows you things exactly as they are. He crossed the garden and stood beside her, and they both looked at the fountain for a while. She said, without turning, "The drainage under this garden is worse than I suspected." He said her name, just her name, Marin. She turned. He said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as a fact and not as gratitude, and not as anything I expect returned. Will you hear it as that?" She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Yes." He said, "You are the most remarkable person I have been in the company of in a very long time. You argued with me in my own carriage on the first night, and you were right to argue, and it was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months. You looked at my estate accounts without being asked, and told me the drainage was wrong and then explained to me precisely why, and you were right about that too. You play the piano as if you are the only person in the room, and it is one of the finest things I have heard in years. You do not want anything from me except to be left in peace, and I have spent my entire adult life in the company of people who wanted a great deal from me, and you have made me understand what has been missing from every room I have been in for the last 15 years. He paused. "I want you to stay, not as a guest, as my wife. And I want you to know that I am asking, not offering an arrangement, and if your answer is no, I will ensure you have everything you need, a settlement, a house of your own, whatever serves you, and I will not raise this subject again. But I wanted you to know." She looked at him for a long moment, and I imagined the garden was very quiet around them. She said, "Why are you telling me this now?" He said, "Because if I do not tell you before Ashwell leaves, I will have spent another month finding reasons to be in whatever room you are in instead of simply saying it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you been finding reasons to be in whatever room I am in?" He said, "Since the second morning." She absorbed this. She turned to look at the fountain. "I have been afraid," she said to the ice, "of mistaking one thing for another, gratitude for something more, relief for I have worked very carefully not to do that. I know. And I think," she stopped. She started again. "I think what I am experiencing is not a mistake. I think it is very precisely what it is. And that frightens me more than the alternative would have done because it is real, and real things can be taken away." He said, "They can." She glanced at him. "You are not going to tell me that this one won't be?" "No," he said, "real things can be lost. That is what makes them real. But I have tried the alternative. I have spent the better part of a year at a remove from everything real. And I can tell you that the absence of the real thing is its own kind of loss, and it is not a smaller one." She was quiet again. He waited. The morning held them both in its cold, clear light. Then she turned and looked at him with an expression that, from what I understand of it, was the first fully unguarded look she had given anyone in a long time, not cautious, not precise, not composed for the room, just open, just her. Just the face of a person who has decided to stop being afraid of the thing they want. She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes, I will marry you, and I want to address the East Garden drainage in spring." He laughed. He laughed the full laugh of a man who had not laughed fully in over a year, and it carried across the garden and reached the drawing-room window, where Mrs. Bray was standing with a cloth she was not actually using on anything, and Mrs. Bray's expression at that moment, as I learned from the housemaid who was in the room at the time, was one of complete and composed satisfaction. The engagement was announced quietly, through the proper channels, with the same lack of ceremony that characterized everything Aldrich did when he was acting from his own inclination rather than social obligation. The letter to Cheswick was drafted by Aldrich's solicitor, a dry and extremely competent man named Farwell who had handled Varnhollow affairs for 12 years and was constitutionally incapable of surprise. And Aldrich asked Marin to review the draft before it was sent, which Farwell received with the expressionless professionalism of a man who had learned not to editorialize about his client's domestic choices. She read the letter in full, in the particular way she read things, quietly, once through, then again with more deliberation. Then she set it down and said, "The fourth paragraph omits any reference to my mother's personal belongings. They were among the estate effects when she died and have been in Mr. Cheswick's possession since the spring. If this letter resolves my situation without naming those items specifically, he will claim them as part of the estate settlement." Farwell looked at the draft, then at Aldrich. Then he said, in the tone of a man acknowledging a fact he would have preferred to have noticed first, "She is correct." He made the amendment. When he left he told Aldrich, with the economy that was his version of high praise, that Miss Elvey had a clear head for legal language of a kind that prevented the sort of omissions that cause litigation 3 years after the fact when everyone has stopped thinking about them. Marin received this report with equanimity. She said she had managed contract correspondence on her father's estate from the age of 19, and had developed the habit of reading for what was absent as much as for what was present, since it is generally the absence that causes the trouble. Her mother's belongings arrived at Varnhollow in a modest box a week later, several pieces of jewelry, 2 small portraits, a quantity of letters, and a writing case that Marin took to her room and I never asked about. She thanked Aldrich for the amendment. He said the amendment was hers. She said that was generous. He said it was accurate. This was their usual mode when the subject was who deserved credit for a thing they had done together. They were married in April in the chapel at Varnhollow. She had not wanted a London ceremony, and Aldrich had not wanted one either, and so they did not have one. The chapel was small and old and lit by plain wax candles that had been lit in it for 300 years' worth of vanes, and the morning was clear after a week of rain, and the light came through the windows in the tentative way that April light comes through old glass, not fully committed, a little surprised by itself, very clean. I stood as Aldrich's witness. Mrs. Bray was there. Several people from the neighboring estates who had, over the preceding months, made the effort to know Marin for herself rather than her circumstances, and had found the effort well rewarded. It was a small gathering of people who were genuinely glad to be there, which is rarer than it should be. When the ring went on her finger, Aldrich held her hand for a moment past the point where ceremony required it. She looked at their joined hands, and then at him, and the look that passed between them in that moment was the kind of thing that does not require interpretation and resists description, and is the reason, if you ask me, that people bother with all the rest of it. The ballrooms and the negotiations and the long cold carriage rides through dark winter nights. What came after the wedding was the quiet architecture of a life, which is the most interesting kind of story to watch from the outside and the most difficult to tell concisely. The drainage in the east garden was addressed in spring, as required, and was, I can report from personal inspection the following summer, significantly improved. The northern tenant arrangements were restructured according to a document Marin wrote out in full, at Aldrich's request, and with his estate manager's initial skepticism, which underwent one revision based on a winter's observation, and thereafter remained the governing approach for the northern holdings and was, by the 3rd year, producing results that the estate manager discussed with colleagues in terms that he probably did not intend to reach Marin's ears, and that she received with equanimity when they did. She became, without making a project of it and without requiring recognition for it, one of the most practically effective duchesses the county had seen in a generation. The tenants knew this first, because tenants always know things first. The neighboring landowners figured it out gradually. Society in its capital form took longer, because society in its capital form tends to be the last to know anything that is happening in the actual world. Aldrich became a man who could reliably be found laughing at something, which those who had known him before the Continental year found remarkable, and those who knew him after found simply characteristic. He came to London more often than before, because Marin found London interesting and he found Marin interesting, and the logic was simple. He could be found in the evenings, in whatever room she was in, which is where he had always been heading. There was one further scene that I need to record, because I was present for it, and because it is the epilogue that this story has earned. 2 years after the wedding, in the height of a London season that was running particularly warm and particularly crowded, there was a gathering at Milbourne Park, the kind of gathering that London puts on when it wants to remind itself of its own importance. Very large, very bright, very full of people who have known each other for too long in the particular way of people who have too much time and not enough to do with it. Aldrich and Marin came, because they came to London things now, as a matter of course, as a unit that the social world had processed and filed under the category of settled, and not particularly in need of discussion. It was late in the evening, and I had been talking to a colonel I knew from the country about something of no consequence, and I was aware of Aldrich and Marin nearby, in the way I am always aware of where they are in a room, not from any anxiety, but from the long habit of the man's friendship, and the newer pleasure of watching the two of them together in company. A woman spoke. I will not give her name. She was a duchess of some consequence, the kind of person who has been so long at the center of a social world that she has come to regard cruelty as a form of wit. She was speaking in a group near where Marin was standing, and she spoke in the carrying tone of a person who intends to be heard by the one person they appear to be speaking past. She said she was sold, you know, at a creditor's gathering. Her stepfather put her up to cover a debt. Rather extraordinary that she should end up at Milbourne Park. The group went a specific kind of quiet, the kind that happens when something has been said that most people in the group were thinking, and several were pleased to have said for them. Marin turned her head and looked at the woman. Not quickly, not with heat, she simply turned her head, as a person turns toward a sound they have identified and assessed and decided how to respond to. Her expression was the composed, level expression I had first seen on her at Chiswick House, standing before 30 men in a gray wool gown with her chin level and her eyes clear. She said, pleasantly and without any particular emphasis, "Yes, and the Duke of Varnhollow paid double. I have always thought it rather a fine story." The group did not know quite what to do with that. It was the answer of a woman who has decided that her history belongs to her, and she will carry it any way she likes, which is the only answer that cannot be argued with. But it was Aldrich who finished it. He had been standing beside her, and he had heard every word, and he turned toward her, not toward the woman who had spoken, not toward the group, just toward Marin, only Marin, and he said, not quietly but not loudly, in the flat certain voice he used for facts, "Considerably more than double. And I have considered it the finest expenditure of my life." She looked at him. What was in her look was the same thing that had been in her look in the chapel at Varnhollow on an April morning with the new light coming through old glass, and at the frozen fountain in November with the cold, honest light on both of them, and in the carriage on the first night when she had argued with him about gratitude and confused him utterly, and he had not recovered. It was the look of a woman who chose, and knew that she chose and was glad. The group around them, dissolved in the way of groups that have witnessed something they will discuss for years, and need a moment to begin composing their accounts of it. I stood with my glass, good wine this time, the Milbourne Park cellar being considerably above Chiswick's, and I thought about a library at Varnhollow in November, and a man staring at a page he was not reading, and the absolute certainty I had felt in that room that he was waiting for something and did not know yet what he was waiting for. I thought about a hall full of candlelight and 30 men, and a woman who found a point on the far wall and breathed and held herself together, and what it costs a person to do that, and the particular grace of a man who crossed the room toward her rather than away. I thought about double it. I have known Aldrich Vane for 30 years now, and I have seen him make decisions that moved money and estates and the livelihoods of hundreds of people. And I have watched him navigate the long, complicated machinery of a great family and a great title with the steady competence of a man who takes his obligations seriously. All of that is true of him, and it is all worth saying. But if I were to tell you the truest thing I know about him, I would tell you about a winter evening in a candlelit hall, and the voice that carried clear across a room full of careful men and named a figure that ended the conversation, and the way that voice sounded not urgent, not heroic, just certain, decided. He had decided before he stood up. He had probably decided from the moment his head turned, and he saw her find her point on the far wall and breathe and hold. He had decided in the way he decided everything that mattered, simply and without reversing it. She was worth every coin and every word and every winter morning in that cold and beautiful house, and he had known it before he could have told you why. And he spent the rest of his life telling her why in the specific and patient way of a man who is glad to have found the thing he was looking for and does not intend to leave it in any doubt. She always was worth it. He always knew. I should tell you more about the weeks in the middle, because the weeks in the middle are where the thing actually happened, and they deserve more than a summary. After the first dinner and the conversation about drainage, something shifted in the texture of the days at Varnhollow. Not dramatically, nothing that Aldrich did was dramatic. He was too private a man for drama, but perceptibly, the way a room shifts when someone opens a window that has been closed for a long time. The air was different. He began asking her questions at breakfast, not the polite questions of a host accommodating a guest, but the genuine kind, the questions of a man who has discovered that the answers are interesting and wants more of them. What had she read the previous day? What did she make of the Eastern Paddock Yield Report, which he had left on the side table the previous evening without comment, and which she had clearly read and formed views about? Whether she had walked the north boundary yet, and what she had seen there. She answered him. Directly, without preamble, without the social padding that most people deploy to fill the space between themselves and the thing they mean. She said yes or no, and then the reason. Or she said she was not sure, and here was what she had observed. Or she said she disagreed, and here was why. It was the kind of conversation that is nearly impossible to have in society because society is very attached to the padding, and nearly impossible to stop once you have started it because neither party wants to. I watched this develop with the particular interest of a man who has known someone a long time and is watching them become, in some specific dimension, more completely themselves. Aldrich at school had been the finest debater in our year, precise, patient, impossible to argue past once he had taken a position. He had carried that quality into his adult life, but had over the years directed it increasingly toward estate business and decreasingly toward anything that could be called pleasure. Watching him argue with Marin about drainage grades and the composition of northern soil and the sequence of tenant contract clauses was watching him remember something he had put aside years ago and was surprised to find he had missed. She was not a passive recipient of his interest. This needs to be said clearly. She did not allow herself simply to be known. She asked him things in return, careful questions that told you she had been observing him with the same precision she brought to everything else. She asked him about the continent, not the social form of the question, not did you enjoy your time there, but what he had been looking for. When he was quiet for a moment, she told him he need not answer, and he said he wanted to, and he told her. I was not present for that conversation, but I was present for the evening after it, and the quality in his face at dinner was unmistakable. A man who has said something true and has not been made smaller by the saying of it. She told him things in return. Not all at once. She was too careful for that, and too private in her own way, but in pieces, as trust allows, which is the only honest way. She told him about her father. A serious and patient man, the kind who makes complicated things feel manageable simply by being calm in their presence. She told him about watching the estate diminish over 3 careful years under the pressure of bad harvests and worse luck, and then about the different quality of diminishment that came with Chesick, the transformation of something she was tending into something she was trapped in. She told him about her mother, which was the hardest thing. I only know this because she told me about it herself, years later, over dinner at Varnhollow with the fire going, and the children in the rooms above having been persuaded to sleep. She said her mother had married Chesick for practical reasons, which are reasonable reasons, and had not been happy, and had been too proud to say so, and watching that had taught Marin the difference between safety and peace with a thoroughness that no other lesson could have matched. I think that is why I argued with you in the carriage, she told me. I needed to be sure for myself, not for him, that I was not doing what my mother had done, taking safety and calling it enough. I said, and were you sure? She smiled in the way she smiled when something was both precise and faintly amusing. By the 4th morning, she said. But in those weeks, before any of it was said, there was the particular pleasure of watching 2 careful people who are falling in love refuse to name it while making no effort to hide it. There was an afternoon in the 2nd week when the weather came in hard from the north and the garden was out of the question, and they spent an entire afternoon in the library, both reading, occasionally talking, the fire going and the rain heavy against the windows. I was there too, nominally reading, in fact watching the quality of 2 people at ease in the same room, which sounds like nothing and is, in fact, the most important thing. He looked up at one point, and she had fallen asleep in the armchair nearest the fire, the book still open on her lap, her head slightly to one side in the attitude of someone who fell asleep very recently and unexpectedly. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down his book, located a blanket in the chest near the door, and placed it over her without disturbing her, and went back to his chair, and picked up his book, and did not read it for some time. I said nothing. He knew I had seen it. The understanding between us did not require words. There were other moments. There was the morning she came down to find the estate manager already in the breakfast room in the middle of a discussion with Aldrich about the northern tenant contracts, and she stood in the doorway and listened to the full conversation before anyone noticed her. And when the manager turned, she said, without apology, "The 3rd clause will not hold," and explained precisely why it would not, and Aldrich looked at the manager and said, "She is right. Begin again from the 3rd clause." The manager's expression in that moment was one of the more satisfying things I witnessed that winter. There was the evening she played something in the music room that neither of us recognized, and afterward Aldrich asked her what it was, and she said, simply and without emphasis, that it was something she had written herself, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has received information significantly more important than its delivery suggested, and is working out what to do with it. There were the estate maps in the library that she had begun annotating, not altering anything, simply making small, precise notations in the margins about what her walks had revealed. Drainage lines that ran differently than the cartographer had shown, frost evidence, places where the land's behavior did not match the record. Her handwriting was so neat it looked printed. He found them one afternoon and read every note, and when he looked up I was watching, and his expression told me everything. Mrs. Bray was conducting the whole domestic enterprise at the household level with a skill that went largely unnoticed by everyone except me. She gave Marin things to do that were genuinely useful without being servile. She invited her opinions on household matters and acted on them. She told her about the house, its history, its character in different seasons, the way it behaved in frost and in thaw, in the comfortable tone of a woman sharing knowledge that belongs to both of them. This was the right tone and had the right effect. I told Aldrich once that Mrs. Bray was the most intelligent person employed at Varnhollow. He said she was the most intelligent person currently in residence at Varnhollow. himself included, and he said it without any irony at all. The Monday evening before I left, Aldrich and I sat in the library after dinner, as we had sat many evenings, and he told me what I have already set down about the quality of rooms she was in and the field after rain. And then he said one more thing. He said, "I think she already knows. She thinks carefully and she misses nothing, and I believe she has known for some time. I think she is waiting for me to say it clearly so that she can decide." I said, "Then say it clearly." He said, "Yes." He meant it as a resolution and carried it into the garden the next morning, and the rest is what I have already told you. Except for this, one more evening, one more year forward. On the night of their first anniversary, Aldrich and Marin had a small dinner at Varnhollow, the kind they preferred, a table of people who were there because they were wanted and not because the occasion required them. After dinner she played in the music room, as she often did in the evenings, and I found myself standing beside Aldrich in the doorway, in the same position I had occupied in the second week of her time at the house, the two of us listening in the warm dark while the fire behind us settled and the music moved through the room. I said quietly, "Well." He said without turning, "Well." I said, "You found what you were waiting for." A pause, then, "I found something considerably better than what I was waiting for." "I was not waiting for anything particular. She is quite specific." She played on. The fire was warm. Outside it was a clear November night, exactly 1 year from the night a carriage had traveled through the cold toward this house, carrying the finest decision Aldrich Vane ever made. He never once regretted it. Neither for a single day of her life did she.